Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Tonight I just wanted to take some time to talk about the Chainsaw Man movie because I fortunately found some time to be able to see it again a second time. The first time I saw the dub and this time I was able to see the sub. So I wanted to take just some time to talk about the differences because if you saw my first video on the dub, you know I really enjoyed it and I thought it was excellent, but I did think a few things were holding it back. And almost all of those issues were sort of fixed by it being in the sub. But beyond that, I also noticed some things, as you do with a second viewing, that were pretty cool that I wanted to talk about. So just a quick spoiler warning, I will be spoiling the Chainsaw Man movie. I will say it is genuinely one of the best movies I've ever seen, and it's especially one of the best, anime/animated movies I've ever seen. So if you have any interest in this, please don't let it get spoiled for you. Check it out first and then come back, because I really can't recommend this one enough. So with that little spoiler warning aside, some things I want to talk about. So, one, I mentioned in my first video that I felt like there was a decent amount of crude humor where I felt like Denji was often acting so cartoonish, and especially in contrast to the rest of the cast, he felt much more cartoonish than the other characters, that I genuinely started to kind of feel that he was annoying. And at the very least, I felt like a lot of the weird, crude humor were sort of would take away from some of the more emotional moments. For example, when he's talking about struggling with his emotions of trying to decide who he's going to dedicate his heart to, and he sort of runs through all of the girls. It's been a while since I've seen the dub, but I feel like he says something along the lines of, it's like I have to choose which breast to touch or something, to that line, except it was a bit more crude. And the line of that is said while we're watching Reze run away from a genuinely terrifying, knife-wielding kind of, killer maniac. And so when I was watching the dub, I just felt like I kept getting annoyed by Denji, and again, in general, I just felt like these sort of quips, if you want to call them that, would often, take away from the movie and the emotional impact of a lot of things. And so in the sub, a lot of that isn't there. Now, I don't know if in the actual Japanese, if he actually is still making those jokes or not. I don't speak Japanese, so I'm not sure. But the subtitles for the film were honestly pretty subdued, which I really felt, lent itself to the film. Because sometimes the film will say some things that, are a little pretentious or a little, highbrow, a little purple prosy, or a little on the nose. But usually that's fine, especially as it is in the sub, where the delivery and the line itself is a bit more subdued than in the dub, where it felt like it was super cartoonish. Because if you're trying to have a character say something kind of deep and they're saying it in this super cartoonish way, it kind of doesn't land. And yeah, so another moment where I'm thinking about it is where Denji is watching movies with Makima, and in the dub he says something where, after they watch each movie, it's oh, that movie, it says some sort of crude joke. I don't remember the exact thing. I don't know if he says, oh, that movie was butts or something like that. And it just made him seem really immature, but in a way that the whole theme of him being sort of immature because he had a bad childhood, not in that way, but where it felt like he would just be really annoying to Makima. While in the sub, the line that we read is just him saying, "That was disappointing." And that sort of subduedness made him feel like just way less annoying. And then you had on top of that the actual delivery of the voice actor felt, it was cranked way more down, so it wasn't in terms of cartoonishness or like flamboyance and like high energy. It was much more like, "Oh, that was disappointing." And then she's able to say, "Yeah, I thought so too. It was trying too hard," or something like that. And so their conversations were actually like more enjoyable because you could actually kind of see why Makima would potentially actually be enjoying herself while hanging out with Denji and stuff like that. And I felt less annoyed with Denji, which made me more emotionally connected to everything, where, I wanted things to work out for this character rather than, someone who just felt a little too much, if that makes sense. But there was also, for example, there's this scene where they sneak into a school late at night, and Reze is basically pretending to be a teacher, and she writes 1 + 1, equals what? And then she asks, Denji, who's the only student, he raises his hand. He's like, "Ooh, I know." He says 2, and she's very good. In the dub, it feels like he literally just kind of like gets too into the moment, and he actually is like blurting out the answer and is like, "Look at me, look at me." While in the sub, it felt more like he was sort of like going along with the joke with her. And he even says like, "Oh, like, I think I sort of get this whole school thing." But it felt more believable that he would think that this girl likes him because he wasn't acting nearly as like cringy and over the top. Like I said, he was acting much more normal, so it made more sense that he would believe that a girl who seems to be sort of out of his league would be into him. While in the dub, it feels like, this attractive, well-adjusted girl, as she appears to be, is suddenly into this guy who's just constantly making lame comments. Like, again, he drinks her coffee, and I feel like he says it tastes like sewer water in the dub, but in the sub, he's sort of like, "Nah, it's sort of like drain water." And he says it in a much more sort of like calm way, like, "Nah, I don't really like this drink," versus like, again, this totally cranked up version. I get that I'm sort of repeating myself, but the point being is that much more sort of subdued, kind of normal delivery of the lines, and also the lines themselves being, translated in a less sort of obnoxious way, made this movie so much more beautiful and emotional, and I felt like I could connect to the emotions a lot more, just because there wasn't this eye roll moment every 5 seconds that sort of cheapened moments. Beyond that, some things that I just sort of wanted to talk about briefly where, I didn't notice it on a first one. So for full context, I've not read the manga, but I've seen the first season of the anime. And so I didn't know who Reze was, so I didn't know what to expect when I was going into the movie the first time. I didn't know if she was going to become a tragic heroine who dies and changes Denji's character motivations, or if she was going to join the group and sort of like awaken to her powers, or if she was going to be sort of like an agent for a different country, which sort of ended up becoming it a bit. And so I didn't know. And so in the first viewing, some of the really interesting symbolism and sort of like aesthetical choices I didn't fully appreciate them. So one, it's pretty cool that the cafe is called the Crossroads. And the thing is again, when it's in a kind of overly obnoxious dialogue way, that sort of thing would seem sort of annoying or too on the nose or something. But with the sub, the whole movie felt much more like it was sort of like, you know, an artistic sort of like motif. And as a result, having, you know, the cafe be the crossroads just sort of made sense with the tone of the movie, because it has this whole ongoing thing about if you'd rather be a country mouse or a city mouse, and it's all about decisions. Do you run away? Do you not run away? All of that stuff. Something else that I thought was really beautiful that I really want to highlight is when Denji and Reze are swimming at the school, there's this sort of parallel foil that's, you know, being shown of a spider that is ensnaring a butterfly in its web. And since I didn't totally know what Reze's deal was the first time when I saw this, I sort of thought it was just, you know, showing that Reze was capturing Denji's heart because he has this whole internal struggle with, you know, is it Reze or Makima? Who's he going to be loyal to, etc. And so I sort of thought it was just that, but then later, as we see, she actually is, you know, trying to kill him and ensnare him in a trap and get him to lower his guard, etc. I thought it was really beautiful that the insect that was chosen to represent Denji was a butterfly, because one of the great conflicts of this is that he had such a traumatic childhood growing up that, you know, he's struggling and things are just finally starting to become good for him, which is sort of like, you know, the caterpillar, you know, goes into the cocoon and then becomes the butterfly. So he's already had a sort of metamorphosis into being a butterfly by the time that Reze is ensnaring him in her web, and that's sort of why he chooses not to run away when she asks. And I just thought that was like shockingly beautiful on a rewatch. And then the other thing that was sort of interesting is realizing when, you know, the whole context of everything, of her childhood and the Soviet stuff and all of that context, when they're on the hill at the festival right before she ultimately attacks Denji and, you know, crosses the boundary, where then, you know, the rest of the movie is basically one long fight sequence. She asks him if he wants to run away. And the first time I saw this movie, I thought that moment was still her sort of just tricking him. Or, you know, maybe sort of a half thing. But on a rewatch, I realized just how earnest that suggestion was, because she already had him where she needed him to be. You know, she was in the secluded area. He had lowered his guard. She had no need to continue to manipulate him by talking about running away or anything like that. And so that moment was, you know, her genuinely asking, not in a trickery way, if he wants to run away and maybe they can just leave all this behind, etc. And it's also sort of beautifully tragic that in that moment only she understands the full context, that the alternative to not running away is that she's going to have to attack him and try to kill him. Because from his perspective, he just thinks she's a student who works at a cafe, and so he doesn't understand why they can't keep dating, and he keeps him his job. So only she understands that, but she asks him and is still hurt when he doesn't choose to, you know, run away. So that was all really interesting. And, you know, one other thing I noticed was, you know, which is probably obvious, but I missed the full punch of it, is that when Makima attacks Reze at the end of the film, she begins her line by saying, "I also would choose the country mouse," which implies that she had been listening to their whole conversation in the school, which just feels all the more sort of twisted and shocking, and was sort of a gut punch in this one. But anyway, I just sort of wanted to give a quick sort of update, I guess you could call it, because while I, you know, certainly praised the movie with my dub review, like I said, I mentioned that I still had some problems with it, and mostly it was that I thought it was getting in its own way. But having seen the sub, and also, which is a mix of what the actual lines are with the sub and the actual vocal performance of the voice acting. It's just so much better in my opinion, and totally removes any sort of issues I had where, like I said, I really genuinely think this is one of the best movies I've ever seen in general. So yeah, just wanted to give sort of a little late night update. I just got it back from the theater and wanted to talk about this. So I'll see you all pretty soon for my next video. But yeah, until then, take care.